Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Hopefully everybody's having a great week. In this video I wanted to review Throw the Warped Wheel Out by Fiction Factory, which was their debut album in 1984. This is the second time they were featured on the channel. I did review their second album called Another Story. I gave that a 62 out of 100. I think it's a good album. It's right on the low side of good album, but it's a good album. But I think one of the things that I really like about there's quite a few things I like about Fiction Factory, but you know they have this kind of classic style of kind of synth pop, but also like a little bit like post disco, and surprisingly a little bit more funk than your normal sort of new wave band. You know, I think a lot of people would compare. Well, I compare this band. I compare Fiction Factory to sort of a blend of like Breathe, or Johnny Hates Jazz, or maybe even a little bit of like Ultravox, because the lead singer has kind of a deep baritone voice. I think a lot of people compare them to like ABC, or maybe a mix of ABC and Spandau Ballet, kind of in that range, kind of that post disco, but also new romantic feel. And I think Fiction Factory are very underrated. I like this album even better than the second album. I do have the second album on vinyl. I do need to get a copy of this particular album. But you know, the thing about Fiction Factory is they grow on you. If you really give their albums a chance, and you like early 80s sounds, I think you're gonna like them. If you don't know them, they're very underrated. You know, again, feels like Heaven. You know, it was a big hit in 1984. I think it went to top 10 or top 15 in England, but they only had like two other maybe top 50 songs in England, and this song was played on MTV. I remember a little bit, and that's why I remember this song. And kind of my history with Fiction Factory is I remember this song back in 1984, and maybe about 20 years ago or so, I like heard it on the radio again, or I heard it somewhere, and I was just like, oh, I remember that song. I really like that song. It's kind of, not only is it nostalgic, but it's also really catchy, and I think it's in a way it's kind of timeless. And so, you know, thanks to the internet and having the internet like we didn't have in 1983 or 84, I could look into the band and hear them more, because they obviously weren't promoted in America. They were sort of one of those second tier kind of, you know, you had the Duran Durans and the Eurythmics and all these popular bands on MTV, and the sort of the second wave of the British invasion, they sort of called it. But there were bands like Big Country that sort of had like one hit, and then you never really heard from them again. And then you look up into them more, and they're really good, and you're kind of surprised why they didn't get more success. But there was just so many bands out there during that time. Probably some of the labels and some of the radio stations were like, well, we can't play everything, you know, like every other single. But you know, there were some bands that just seemed like they were promoted a lot more than some other bands. And sadly, Fiction Factory, you know, went away after two albums, unfortunately. And you know, so again, I got a chance to look back into them maybe 10 or 15, 20 years ago when I bought this 7-inch, when I heard it again, and I was really impressed by actually hearing the whole album. And that probably helped because, you know, there is kind of a 80s, it's been going on for a long time, like an 80s sort of nostalgic kind of sound that's been going on in the underground, and a lot of popular in electronic music for the last like 20 years. And so, you know, but not only that, because I really grew up through that period, so it sounds really familiar to me. But I love finding deeper cuts in these albums like this. In Fiction Factory, if you really listen to the album, there's always like some deep cuts in there, and some sort of secondary songs and maybe other singles that you might really like, and that I really like. And you know, again, I'm really surprised by the level of funk by the bass player. The lead singer is really strong. You kind of deep baritone. Sometimes I feel like maybe the only maybe thing from keeping them on the high side of like maybe calling a very good album, or you know, putting them in the upper tier of bands in this period. Just maybe the consistency on the albums. Maybe the consistency isn't quite there, and both albums are kind of an example of that. But I think if you play them all the way through, they start to get better. It's one of those bands, but I just have like a soft spot for their music because they only did 2 albums, and there's of course quite a few good songs on there. Of course, this album starts with "Feels Like Heaven," which is a classic. I gave it 8 3/4 stars. It's so good. It's so catchy. 3.5 minutes. It's one of those songs I could just play over and over and over and over and over and over again. In fact, they probably felt the same way because the song's on both sides of the single, so they're probably equally as impressed. But it's such a great song. It's so it kind of has like a 60s kind of shimmering, kind of dreamy quality to it. I wouldn't say it's like a early shoegaze song at all, but it's sort of, even though it's pop and synth pop, it sort of has that kind of hazy feel in it in some ways. But just love the vocals and love the chorus, and it's just, again, it's one of those songs I could just play over and over. And then the second track, Hearts and Mine, this is kind of where I get the sort of post disco feel from them, sort of like ABC, or, to cut a long story short, by Span Ballet. It kind of has that post disco sound and a little bit of new romantic in there. But really good song though. I gave that one 7 stars. And then Panic is my third favorite song on the album. It's very cool sounds. Love the keyboards as well. My second favorite song is track number 9, The First Step. The harmony, the fade, the ballad feel, just the chorus, and it's just kind of very. It's just kind of I would say nice for saying. Sometimes I say nice a lot, and but it's just really nice. It's just easy on the ears and nice and soft, and it's just kind of a lighthearted ballad that just kind of like lulls you into happiness. It's just good harmonies, good melodies, and stuff like that. They just do a good job. And even tracks like in the middle album is probably the weaker. Like the first 3 tracks really strong, and then it ends with the last 3 tracks. I think it ends on a strong note. Maybe the middle 4 tracks are sort of the lower part for me, but nothing less than a 5.5. I have The Hanging Garden 5 3/4, All or Nothing 6 1/4, Hit the Mark, and Ghost of Love, both 5.5. Ghost of Love, even though it was a single, isn't quite there for me as far as like I would rather have picked one of these other songs for a single. Tales of Tears, the chorus wins you over in this particular track. Like at first, it feels like, oh, okay, it's just maybe another pretty good track, and then the chorus kind of wins you over a little bit. That track is one where it kind of grows on you. And also, again, the last 2 tracks. The First Step, I gave 7 3/4. My second favorite song on there again, and then it ends with the title track on the album, The Warped Wheel. One of my favorite tracks there. Probably looks like by my ratings, my 5th favorite, 6.5. But just an overall really good album. I gave this album a 66 out of 100. So, their second album I gave a 62, and then this one I gave 66. Both good albums. They both grow on you. The more, if you listen to them 2, 3, 4 times in a row, I think if you don't know this band, I think you'll enjoy it if you like 80s music. I mean, there's something whimsical and innocent about their music. Just very, very simple and very catchy at the same time. Some are upbeat, some are a little disco, some are synth pop, some have a little bit of funk in there, some nice ballads in there. You think the singing is good, layering, mixing is good, all the sounds are good. I think when you hear a band like this, you always kind of think like, man, I wish they did like a third or a fourth album, or you just want more from them. Like maybe there was, some demos. There's really nothing been released since there's not really any even best ofs or B-sides that came up. They still play live. I've seen quite a few shows of them online, like they're still playing at like small festivals and stuff like that, and they have some some cult fans here and there. I would imagine, especially in Scotland, where they're from. But I just wish I heard some more from them, another album or maybe some demos and stuff like that. But because I really like their sound. It's nostalgic in all the good ways, and but there's a part of me that if they would have made an album in 1987, 1988, 1989, I think it would have been probably misguided or maybe just not. It's almost like they're a product of their period too. Like I don't think they would have made it past 84, 85, 86. Like styles were changing so much. New wave wasn't out so much. It wasn't so fresh and new. And a lot of the new wave bands and And synth pop bands made a lot of bad decisions as the 80s went on. You think of like Duran Duran, sort of notorious, and then even all the way to like Liberty and stuff like that. Just some rough albums. They're a great example. There's a lot of, even Human League made some errors and made some bad judgment calls and trying to be too poppy and go and really just try to have hits and stuff like that. And there's bands like this I don't think would have quite made it unless they stayed cult. Stayed true to who they were, or had some sort of edge to them, like a Depeche Mode or New Order or The Cure or something like that. Like they were kind of that upper tier, but also had a little bit of a, I don't know, like even ABC. I mean, Spandau Ballet was a good example of a band that didn't make it past the middle '80s. But you think of like ABC, they kind of embraced house music and embraced techno and stuff like that, and sort of evolved that way and still did fairly good. But even they kind of fell off, after Abracadabra in 1991. So there's not a lot of bands that sounded like this that would have stayed true through the later '80s. So in a lot of ways, I would kind of wish there wasn't a third album, for fear that it wouldn't be as good as these. But if there was some early demos and stuff, maybe an album before this, if this band came out like '81 or '82, and there was another album at that time, I think it would have been great. They just kind of they capture that early '80s sound that I think if you're into '80s music and you really dig deeper into the better stuff, I really love the early '80s stuff, even more so than the later '80s. I think by the later '80s, I was getting more into like instrumental music and new age and techno and house and different styles of dance music, and not so much into the new wave as much, because a lot of the bands were not fresh anymore and really kind of doing that kind of new wave sound. Like you even think of like Depeche Mode, like even though they were synth pop and like Strange Love, and maybe they kind of sort of changed into like electro pop and went a little different, and then started adding guitars and stuff like that. So a lot of these bands really needed to change in the middle '80s. Otherwise, if they were gonna kind of maybe get dropped by their label, that was probably a big pressure in the middle '80s to make hits. Otherwise, your label's going to drop you, because there wasn't Bandcamp in the late '80s. Middle '80s, there wasn't. You had to get somebody to pay hundreds of thousands and thousands of dollars to spend 8 months in a studio. You're not going to come out of that pocket and get a top producer and top engineer in those days and be able to make an album unless you got a label funding it. So there must have been a lot of pressure in those days to write hits. Otherwise, you're not going to make another album. And then maybe that's sort of what happened to Fiction Factory after that second album. They didn't have the hit that the first album did, and unfortunately the label dropped them. But if they would have been out now, they would have been kind of a band that would have continued to do new music, I think, because they have the avenues, and they have the talent enough to make multiple albums, I think, and would have had kind of a cult following, and I think would have been continuing to do new music. Thankfully, they're still touring. That's a great way to make money for an older artist or an artist that doesn't have a big following. They still can do some tours and stuff like that and get some dates. So that's cool. I'm sure it's probably not their main job, for a band like this. Well, although they probably get some good, some decent checks, from their back catalog, but not probably enough to live on, I would think, for an artist like this who only had 2 albums. That would be an interesting question to see what the financial status are of bands like this that had maybe one hit 40 years ago and really only had 2 albums. I would find that kind of interesting. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Fiction Factory. I think they're an underrated group. This is my second review for them, so unfortunately they won't be on this channel anymore unless I include them in some other video, because there's nothing else to review. But 2 really good albums from a very small Scottish band that was around for like 2 years, and that's kind of a cool nostalgic kind of I kind of have a soft spot for their music, because it takes me back to when I was 6, 7, 8 years old. Really cool stuff. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Fiction Factory. Throw the Warped Wheel out. Gave a 66 out of 100. Good album. Curious to know what your thoughts are, if you like Fiction Factory, if you heard any of their either of the 2 albums, and maybe what's your top 3 favorite songs by Fiction Factory. Put them down in the notes. If there's something that you'd like me to review, could be old, could be new, my email's down below. Just send me a quick suggestion, and I'll get back to you. All right, thanks so much, and we'll see you on the next video.